Much have been with us. Lebanese leaders agreed a new government led by the Sunni Muslim tycoon Najib Mikati. He says he'll seek new IMF talks. The new government follows a year of political impasse. The current crisis, made worse, of course, by the massive explosion that wrecked the port of Beirut in August last year, is the worst since Lebanon's civil war. Let's hear from the new Prime Minister.
From today, we shall work hand in hand with each other. It's true, it's taken time to cooperate with the President, but we have formed a government. Nothing is perfect, but I promise you that our team will be cohesive. We are going to work tirelessly to avoid disappointment and despair.
Let's get more analysis and go straight to our correspondent, Sally Farhat, who's in Beirut. Sally, good evening to you. Tell us, there is presumably a plan in place.
So Najib Mikati, after he was announced Prime Minister and the cabinet lineup was announced earlier today, has promised the Lebanese, as we heard in part of his speech, that he will work along with the government to make sure he responds to the country's economic and social crises. He did say that he has a plan, but he did not reveal this plan just yet. But what we do know is that this plan is guided by two priorities. The first priority is clearly to respond to the economic crisis that Lebanon is going through. And part of this priority will be to revive the talks or conversation with IMF. And then the second priority is to hold the parliamentary elections that are set for summer 2022. And this means the government does not only need to plan and execute the next elections, but it also needs to ensure that a right environment is there for elections to actually take place. And this means that the social and security problems in the country need to be largely controlled and responded to in order for the elections to take place. So these are the two guiding priorities.
Sally, there's obviously a big difference between hope and expectation and what might actually happen. I wonder what the hopes and expectations are of going into talks with the IMF, and what does the government and the new Prime Minister think might happen?
So the formation of the new government today opens up the possibility for reviving this conversation with the IMF. Mikati, as mentioned, clearly has the talks with IMF as one of his top priorities, but he did say that the political disputes and different political interests in the country need to be set aside before Mikati will be able to do any conversation with the IMF. And this is to avoid opposition locally at a later stage when the IMF conversation starts, as what happened almost a year ago. But if these conversations were revived and if Lebanon were to resume its mandate with the IMF, this would be promising given the role IMF plays in ensuring an effective international monetary stance for Lebanon, and the Lebanese, or some of them at least, have high hopes on reviving this conversation in hopes of helping Lebanon get out or step out of its economic crisis.
It's an economic crisis, and I think for many viewers that becomes, two words that really sort of begin to lose meaning, because we can talk about different depths of economic crisis. But I know you're there in your own home in Beirut with no electricity. You've told me that already. So that's one aspect of how you are suffering. But, sort of tell us a bit more about how other people are suffering too. How bad are things where you are?
So aside from the electricity crisis in the country, actually in Lebanon, almost all regions do not receive more than 2 hours of electricity per day. And this is one. And aside from the fact that we have to stand in long lines in order to fill up our cars with gasoline, aside from all these small day-to-day things that we have to deal with, citizens are really denied access to their basic needs, including medicine. And this is not only because more than 74% of the population is now poor, but also because most of the basic needs are no longer available in the country. So even if you have the money or the means to buy whatever you need, most likely you're not even going to find what you need in the country. So the scarcity of resources is mostly related to the shortages of dollars in the country and the failed subsidization plan that was carried on for over a year, and that has indeed negatively affected the economy through putting additional pressure on the local currency and has caused inflation. The situation in Lebanon remains horrible, to say the least, and the electricity in this live is clearly an example of how it is for us here. But there are some hopes now that the government is formed, that Lebanon will at least be capable of receiving the millions of dollars worth of aid that the country was promised by the French initiative. And there are hopes that this aid will at least be able to be used for for any sort of relief for the Lebanese.
Indeed, that aid, of course, all kicked off by Emmanuel Macron, wasn't it? So obviously we're waiting to see how that gets, well, first of all, freed up, and then, of course, how it's used. Sally Farhat, our correspondent in Beirut, thank you very much indeed.